Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Carrie Wise, veterinarian, certified life coach, and founder of the personal development company JoyfulDVM. Today I want to spend some time talking about triggers. And what kind of got me thinking about this was just paying attention to what's happening on social media and actually all around me. So I know that you guys are seeing and experiencing the same things. What I'm seeing is as people post stuff, their opinions, pictures, memes, whatever, on social media, there is often a whole bunch of comments that follow, right? So people read what other people write, people look at the pictures that are posted, and people comment right away. Now, this is not new, right? This is just kind of how social media works. We see this all the time. But what I've seen is a trend in people being even more passionate in their responses. A lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of sadness, a lot of guilt. So a lot of emotion that's coming out. And the things that are being written in those comments are fascinating to watch. I think people are bolder than usual at responding to things that trigger them. So I was kind of considering this not only as just looking as a general feed, but then also started paying attention to it when I've been out and about in the limited amount that I have been, seeing how people have exaggerated responses to what they typically do. And I started thinking about that in consideration, like in respect to our veterinary professions in general. And what I realized was that this whole concept of being triggered, which typically like we tend to reserve the idea of getting triggered to somebody who's been through some type of trauma, that actually getting triggered isn't just related to a traumatic event at all. So I've done a little bit of research into that, and I wanted to dig into it, and I wanted to show you what it is, what's happening, and give you some examples that I've been seeing that have been going on. So the first one, and I've got a cat in the way, and I see Carrie out there. Hello, nice to see you out there. So the first one, like, let's just define it. Like, what on earth is trigger? So to be triggered, or a trigger, there's lots of different definitions. So I'm going to give you a few of them. One of them, more of a psychological definition, is something that sets off a memory of a previous trauma, including an emotional response. Including the emotional response. So that's kind of everything. So you've got the thing that sets off a previous trauma, so like thoughts about a previous trauma, and then you have the subsequent emotional response. That definition went on to say that the things that could set it off, so the triggers themselves, could be anything that relates to the senses. So sights, sounds, touches, smells, tastes. So the five senses, anything that could like activate one of those could bring up this previous trauma, thoughts about that, and then the emotional response. And so the way that works when we're looking at a very specific traumatic prior event is that when you go back to thinking about that, it kind of like throws you back into the past, right? So you land there and you feel all of the emotions that you felt at that time. What's real is that it's not actually happening again, right? It's all just happening in our mind. And it is the things that we're thinking about that traumatic experience thinking about it today, that's bringing up the emotions today. So that's kind of the most historical and most like commonly understood definition of a trigger from a psychological standpoint. Kind of more broadly, another one that I found, another definition was any topic that makes us feel uncomfortable, which that would apply, right? So anything that happens that makes you feel uncomfortable could be considered a trigger. Makes sense. I like to look at it as when you experience something that results in a sudden and intense emotional response. That's the way that I like to define trigger. So regardless of your definition, basically what you've got is you've got something that somebody says or does or something that you experience that all of a sudden you have an intense emotional response to. We would label that as a trigger. Now, why is it important to understand that? Well, it's important to understand that because we also, as a culture, tend to have a lot of beliefs around triggers, like who's responsible for not triggering you. We feel very entitled to feel comfortable all of the time. And so if we're ever put in situations or we experience things, hear things that make us feel uncomfortable, then it's very common that, that we would go on the attack and go after whatever that trigger is. So like if your trigger is thunderstorms, this is why this is kind of skewed. I think I'm almost out of coffee. Yeah, so why this is a little bit skewed, like way to look at this, is because like things, if we're thinking about traumatic events, like you could have been through a massive storm, like a thunderstorm, like a tornado, and had your house ripped apart. And then every time there's bad weather that has the threat of tornadoes, you could feel very uncomfortable. That tornado, that weather event could be the trigger to the intense emotional response that you feel. You might feel afraid, you might feel even maybe a little bit anger and uncertain, but you're probably not from there going to go after the storm, right? Like you can't actually do anything to stop the storm. So in that case, the way that we respond to our trigger is just by trying to do what we can to protect ourselves. So from fear, we would maybe make sure that we take shelter, or we would make sure people are notified if we have friends and family in the area that might not know there's a storm coming. Like we might do those kinds of things. But we can't actually stop the trigger, right? The only thing we can do is decide how we feel about it and then take action. And what we miss when we are triggered is that between the trigger and the way that we feel, we actually have some power there. So that's where all of our thoughts about it live. So if you've been through a tornado, to use that example, you've been through a tornado and they terrify you and you're scared and all of that, then when there is bad weather, many of us automatically feel scared and all of that again because we haven't stopped to separate it out and say, okay, just because there's thunderstorms doesn't mean a tornado is going to happen right now. But if a tornado warning does occur, I know what to do. This is what I will do next. Like we don't stop to think about it. We just go from tornado to freaked out and we feel like we don't have any control. I wanted to start with this one because it doesn't involve a human. Because I wanted to illustrate to you that the things that trigger us in the intense emotional responses, they don't come from the thing. So that emotional response isn't actually the tornado that's causing it. In between the tornado warning and the emotional response is what you're believing about the tornado warning. Oh my gosh, here comes another tornado. I might die. Our house might get ripped apart. Some people might get hurt. All of that is what's creating all of the emotion, the fear and all of that. So it's super important to take a look at that. Because now if we can consider that and how triggers work and look at some other things that are going on, you can see actually where you have power there. And this is the part that's so important to hear. Because many of us have believed that if you're triggered, that it's the fault of the person or thing triggering you and that they should not have triggered you. And that belief just leaves you at the victim of whatever the trigger is. Like, why would you want to be a victim? You actually aren't, because emotional responses to anything are completely within your control. That's really hard to see, and for people who have never ever learned this information, they're easily triggered. And that's what I found so fascinating by keeping an eye on social media and just kind of watching and exploring what's happening around me and seeing how people are reacting, because I can see how people are triggered at all kinds of different levels right now. And they feel very justified in the actions that they take from those intense emotional responses that they're having. I see this personally every single day right now in my own Facebook feed related to JoyfulDVM posts. So any of you guys that have been around JoyfulDVM for a while, you know that I have a huge mission to empower veterinary professionals, to help you understand why you feel so miserable, why we have so much suffering in this profession. Not so you can run away from it, so you can understand what's happening and you can see that the emotional response you're having, the suffering that you're having from this profession doesn't come from this profession. It comes from what you believe about this profession. This is such a paradigm shift. It's a completely different perspective than what we've had for years, because the seeds were planted that this career field had inevitable stress, anxiety, and high rates of suicide, right? Like that was the thought, that was the seed that was planted. That's what we were told. And so what you focus on, you create more of. And through that lens, if we've looked at everything through the lens of this profession necessarily equates to high anxiety, stress, and high rates of suicide, then everything that we experience through that lens. What that also means is that anything that contradicts that idea creates cognitive dissonance, which is just like this battle in our brain, two contradictory ideas, and that can be a trigger.